The weekly Cybercrime and Business podcast is brought to you by SurfWatch Labs. SurfWatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on. Hey everybody out there, today is Friday, May 29th, 2015. I am Jeff Peters, SurfWatch Labs editor. I'm here with Matt Leifus, SurfWatch Labs writer, and Michael Tell, SurfWatch Labs data analyst. A little bit later, after our discussion and some of the top headlines from the week, we have an interview with Rick Kam. He's the president and co-founder of ID Experts. I got a chance to chat with him yesterday. Earlier this month, ID Experts sponsored Ponemon's 5th annual benchmark study on privacy and security of healthcare data. So we got a chance to chat about that and sort of what's going on in the healthcare sector. One quick note, next week, hacksurfer.com is moving. They're becoming part of SurfWatch Labs news and analysis. Won't mean much for this podcast other than you're not going to be able to find us on hacksurfer.com anymore. So make sure to follow us on iTunes, Podbean, YouTube, or wherever else you listen so you don't miss any of our future podcasts. But yeah, going right into it, throw it over to you, Matt, for the top cyber headlines from the past week.
Sure, and we'll go through the top 3 new trending industry targets first seen in SurfWatch Labs data. Coming in at number 3 this week, we have Southwest Licking School District. Say that 5 times fast, everybody. The school district alerted residents that a student of the school successfully hacked the school's student information system. This student was able to obtain 112 records from his fellow classmates, but only passed on the information pertaining to one of them. This actually occurred back in April 2015, but it was mentioned this week. Coming in at number 2 was this actually led to several targets that we saw in the data, but they all are related to this one event. Coming in at number 2, we have the breach of Medical Management LLC. An employee for the company illegally shared patient information from a group of hospitals. The hospitals included Grandview Health, Valley Health System, Holy Name Medical Center, Englewood Hospital, Thomas Jefferson University Hospital, and Ponemon Health System. The information included patient names, social security numbers, and birth dates. Medical Management LLC has contracts with 40 physician groups across the United States, so there's a chance that you might hear more about this breach. There just possibly like maybe another hospital was affected. We'll wait and see on that. Of course, we'll keep you updated. And the number 1 target, I'm sure everyone's heard about it, the IRS. The government agency was attacked by unknown hackers through their Get Transcript tool. And this is a tool that allows, I'm sure some of you have used it, it allows you to access your old tax returns. Sometimes like for mortgages and stuff, you need this information. The hackers attempted to download about 200,000 forms from the tool. They were only successful in getting 104,000. Of these 104,000 forms, they used 15,000 of them to file fraudulent tax returns. In news today, the IRS has come out and said through their investigation, they believe that this attack actually originated in Russia. Something might be worth talking about. But those are the top 3 new trending targets of the week, and I think we can kick it right off with the IRS guys. Yeah, they came out today in news. When I typed up the weekend review, the news was about 2 hours old from what I saw, but it was on CNN Politics. They believe through investigation that this attack originated in Russia, so we'll probably hear more about that in the future.
Yeah, that's interesting to a certain extent, but pretty much every story that's in the news is either China or Russia, so who cares, kind of from that point of view?
That's true. A lot of the criminal organizations or enterprises operate out of Eastern Europe and especially Russia, so it's not really that surprising. Would be even more interesting if there's any government sponsorship, but that's just speculation. I doubt that there was.
One of the things, I think more importantly, just kind of like what you guys said, it could be China, Russia. That's really not what's important. It's more about protecting the data in the first place. One of the interesting things that I came across, I wrote an article about this yesterday, part of what the IRS is doing is for the 104,000 individuals that were affected, they're sending out, number one, they're giving them free credit monitoring, which you hear a lot of companies do. And number two, they're giving them a PIN. It's a unique 6-digit number that will be used every time they file a tax return. Obviously, this would dramatically mitigate the effects of identity fraud and things like that. One of the questions I had was, why doesn't the IRS do that for everybody? Currently, people in 3 states can get this. Well, 3 states. You got Florida, Georgia, and then the District of Columbia. And then only if you were affected like through something like this, like your identity was taken, then you get the PIN. Why don't they do that for everybody?
I think that's something that they would actually like to do. I read something on CNN Money just recently. They were quoting the IRS commissioner, and the article said that the IRS would like to update its website to require a password when filing taxes in order to help, have that extra level of authentication. The closest thing that they have now is that 6-digit PIN, but like you said, that option is only available to residents in a few different states. But just with the recent budget cuts and things like that, I think it's just a monetary issue of them actually being able to implement that kind of authentication that they'd like to.
And that's an interesting point, because the IRS in recent times, as the commission, you pointed out, the IRS's budget has been cut significantly just due to whatever reasons, mainly political. What I also found interesting is that the IRS has also cut its cybersecurity staff by 11% over the last 4 years. In 2011, they had employed about 410 people, but as of 2014, they only had about 363, which is not like a big dent, but given the fact that they're handling hundreds of millions of sensitive tax records, it would make sense to actually invest in the cybersecurity staff, or even contracts that address this.
And just to, I guess, maybe the other side of the coin and stand up for the IRS a little bit, I also read that between 2011 and 2014, the IRS spotted and halted $63 billion worth of fraudulent tax returns. So it appears that they're stopping a good amount of them. And also this breach, I wouldn't even necessarily call it a breach, basically just them reusing these stolen Social Security numbers and information through this Get Transcript service. And the IRS, in their statement, they suggested that the growing availability of taxpayers' personal information on social media and other data breaches, we've seen so many of them lately, is just going to increase this problem. And this could be something that could happen at other agencies outside the IRS as well.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think we'll start focusing on here soon, is the secondary effects of initial breaches, where criminals will buy hundreds of users' credentials and try to plug and use that information to steal additional information from users or fraudulently file tax returns. I think there's going to be a lot of secondary effects that we'll be seeing here in the next couple of months.
Yeah, one other interesting thing I thought we could chat about is just the number of healthcare breaches that we've seen. Matt, you kind of talked about this a little bit with the Medical Management LLC and that employee sharing personal health information. But I was in SurfWatch Labs data just about an hour ago, just looking at some of these numbers, and it actually surprised me. I mean, I know we've been writing a lot about different healthcare-related breaches recently, but May is really kind of on pace to be the top month for the year in all sorts of categories. Looking at the number of companies who have had data targeted, there's 34 distinct industry targets. Email accounts, previously the entire year, there's only been 11 healthcare organizations who've had email accounts targeted in our data, and just this month alone, there's already 14. So we're just seeing a growing number of, especially I'd say phishing-related incidents leading to personal health information being compromised, but also we're seeing more insiders and more insurance breaches and things like that. Probably the biggest healthcare story of the past week was this breach at CareFirst BlueCross BlueShield. And that's another insurance breach similar to what we've seen at Premera and Anthem. FireEye, they did some research into who was behind the breach, and they said that it was orchestrated by a sophisticated threat actor that we have seen specifically target the healthcare industry over the past year. So they're kind of alluding that it might be the same actors, but they didn't come right out and say it. But in terms of what happened, there was 1.1 million people affected who might have their users' names, their members' names, birth dates, email addresses, and subscriber numbers all exposed. And the attack occurred in June 2014. So yeah, it's just another company, I guess, another insurance company that we can add to the tally this year that have been breached.
Another smaller health system reported a breach this week. Apparently, the malicious actors were able to gain access to employee email inboxes exposing personal and protected health information. Beacon claims that there's no evidence that any information was used maliciously, however. But again, harking back to what this trend data that we're talking about, there's been significant activity in the healthcare sector with CareFirst. Now, they're the smaller healthcare systems are getting hit. I think a lot of criminals and other groups are starting to catch on that health records in PHI are worth a lot more money. Adding on to that, I also read this week that the cost per healthcare record is around $20 to $80, which is significantly more than just credit card records or any sort of information along those similar lines.
One thing that I've noticed, guys, and maybe I'm alone on this, it just seems like in the healthcare industry, there's so many different ways you hear about these organizations being compromised, whether it's through, for instance, the Medical Management LLC breach, it was an employee. You have state-sponsored actors, kind of like with Primera or Anthem. You have even, things like lost or stolen laptops or ransom attacks where they hold like information ransom. It just seems like in the healthcare sector, there's so many different ways that they are targeted. And it's probably true of all sectors, but it just seems like it really is highlighted in the healthcare sector.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think what's unique about the healthcare sector is a lot of the employee negligence and insider sort of threats where people lose laptops or, you'll have an individual in a hospital or a doctor's office or something steal patient data or personal information for their own gain. I think that's what's unique about it. But now I see, I think of one big trend is that criminals and state sponsors are starting to catch on to that. Healthcare records have a lot. And since we're digitizing them a lot, they're starting to become a bigger and bigger target.
Yeah, and if you guys want more information on that, that's actually a lot of what we talked about with Rick Kam in this Ponemon study. One of the main points from there was just that criminal attacks in healthcare are up 125% compared to 5 years ago. So in addition to those other fronts you mentioned, now we're seeing a lot more criminal activity as well. But moving on to the cyber tip of the week, one interesting report that came out was by Google. They did a pretty in-depth study on security questions, which I think everyone knows in general are kind of crappy, but it was kind of nice to see some data behind it. Basically, the conclusion of their report was, they said, we conclude that it appears next to impossible to find secret questions that are both secure and memorable. And they said that while secret questions continue to have some use when combined with other signals, they should not be used alone. And best practice should favor more reliable alternatives, such as like sending a text message or using a backup email account to recover a lost account or whatever. So yeah, I mean, if you're a business out there and you're on the web and you're having people being able to recover accounts with just security questions, and you didn't already know this, probably a good idea to try to move to a more secure form of authentication. All right, now coming up, we have that interview with Rick Kam about the Ponemon healthcare study. To get started, at least anecdotally, I guess I've noticed a shift the past year, where previously, it was mostly lost and stolen devices and some insider theft. This year we've seen a whole lot more of the criminal element in the sector. And looking at the data in your guys' report, that was one of the conclusions you guys found as well. Just wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure, Jeff. The Ponemon report each year looks at the causes of breaches. And as you mentioned, in the past several years, there was more breaches caused by an accidental loss of a laptop or thumb drive, or perhaps a rogue employee or an employee accidentally exposing data. And in many cases, as I mentioned, accidentally is probably a key operative word. What was different, unique about this year's findings was that for the first time, the criminal attacks on healthcare systems created more breaches of protected health information than any other cause. In fact, the criminal attacks were up 125% compared to 5 years ago, which is a significant change.
Yeah, I guess one of the stats that stood out to me was, I believe it said more than 90% of healthcare organizations in the study had experienced a data breach. But even more surprisingly, 40% had more than 5 data breaches over the past 2 years. I mean, that really surprised me. Does that surprise you as well?
You know, it's not as surprising. The number of breaches organizations have experienced has continued to be pretty steady over the last few years. Probably the more surprising thing, though, is that the way, again, that these breaches are occurring and the number of records seems to be climbing. And I guess, like I would tell you, what surprises me is that, unfortunately, I think the criminals are winning over our cybersecurity friends and the tools that they're using, because the problem seems to be getting worse versus getting better.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think this is the 5th year the study's been done. So I'm wondering if there's any other maybe statistics or trends that stand out, or if they're all sort of maybe a continuation of the past couple years' trends.
So some of the key differences, I think, that were notable from the findings this year, Jeff. One key one was that in this year's study, business associates, those organizations that also manage patient information, whether it be billing, health plan information, claims processing, or cloud services organizations, they were also included as part of the study. And so what was interesting this year was that we got some insight into whether or not they were seeing kind of the same issue, their systems and their ability to protect this data. And I guess I would tell you, the good news is that the percentages of organizations that are experiencing breaches as a business associate is less than the covered entities, the healthcare providers themselves. But before we can jump up and down and say, and cheer on that particular issue, it is only the first year that we've captured that data. And so it may be a matter of organizations recognizing what the survey is looking for as part of the challenge. So the net of it is organizations, whether they're in healthcare as covered entities or as business associates, basically the organization supporting them, this seems to be a continuing trend and a continuing problem.
I was talking to someone, and they just kind of brought up the fact that everyone always focuses on these big breaches, but they were just kind of putting the thought out there, if you added up all the small breaches, 50 records here, a few hundred there, they might actually possibly be more than all these big breaches. And I noticed in the report you guys said, I believe it was, that the reported data breaches are only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to security incidents. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that thought a little bit.
Yeah, so there's two thoughts there. One is, you mentioned the number of breaches in healthcare. Perhaps the number of small breaches may exceed the number of records that were exposed in the context of large healthcare breaches. I guess one way to look at that particular statistic is to go to the Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights, basically Wall of Shame, their data breach notification website. Since they started tracking the number or the breaches in healthcare that come under the HIPAA and high-tech legislation requirement of notifying consumers when an organization does have a breach, I think what I remember seeing is up till this year, when some of the very, very largest healthcare breaches have ever occurred, somewhere close to 14 million records have been exposed over the course of probably 90,000 small breaches. And as you mentioned earlier, these are breaches that might be 5 or 10 or 50 or 100 records versus the millions of records we're seeing now in some of the larger breaches this year with Anthem, Primera, recently BlueCross BlueShield of our CareFirst in Maryland just earlier this week.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about all this medical ID theft that we're seeing, because the FBI has been warning that I guess the healthcare sector is sort of the perfect place to steal this kind of information. You got the personal, medical, and financial information all together. And then on the other side, you have this sort of push for electronic health records, which is consolidating all that data into one place. So, just putting those two thoughts together, it seems like this is a problem that's only going to get worse before it gets better. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I actually would agree with that. In fact, there was another study that the Ponemon Institute completed and published earlier this year. I think it was back in March of this year, sponsored by the Medical Identity Fraud Alliance, MIFA for short. It was the fifth year of that particular study, also on medical identity theft and medical fraud. And what it showed was that the number of people falling victim to medical identity theft has increased, I think it was 22% year over year this year versus last year. So as opposed to 1.8 million Americans falling victim to medical identity theft, this last year it was 2.3 million victims of medical identity theft. And Jeff, you did mention one of the drivers of this. It turns out that the value of a health record is worth more in the black market due to its ability to basically do more things with that identity relative to creating financial benefit to the criminal parties, if you will. I think we saw recently a number where the FBI talked about a medical record being valued at somewhere between $60 and $70 a record versus your Social Security number or a financial account being somewhere close to $1 or 50 cents a record. So it's reflected in the value of health records in the black market.
And I guess getting back to this criminal element that we're seeing growing, one of the stats from the study said that only 40% of healthcare organizations and 35% of business associates are concerned about cyber attackers, kind of despite that shift that we're seeing. Do you think it's just sort of the lag time of them sort of catching up with what's actually happening, or is it just that they don't have maybe the funding to deal with it, so they're putting it in other places?
I think it's a combination of issues. One of the issues, I believe, is because the healthcare organizations in general are now seeing that these types of attacks, or they're recognizing that there is, malware being injected into their networks and their systems. And so if the question is asked again next year, I think we'll see that number be significantly higher, right? When you think about the major breaches that have happened in healthcare over the last few months, being, Anthem, BlueCross BlueShield, Anthem, Primera, again, most recently, CareFirst, when the forensics have been done on those particular issues, all of them had some element of, criminal, malicious attack and the use of malware associated with their particular events. And I think, the CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers, and CIOs of healthcare organizations are really concerned that their networks may have also been, part of a malware attack, and they're trying to figure that out.
Yeah, so I just wanted to get your thoughts in general. If we take a bird's eye view, for example, if someone asked me who didn't know anything about cybersecurity, why these breaches can't be stopped, I think I would probably use a hospital as an example, just because you have, all the device theft and loss that was a problem. You have this criminal problem. You have so many different people with their hands in the cookie jar and different attack vectors. And then you have things like connected devices. So I guess just looking at all, if you're trying to give some advice to an organization or someone doing security at one of these organizations, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I would tell them two things. One is probably the most mind-bending issue would be that they should consider the fact that their systems have probably been breached, right? If you think about the mindset of a CISO in an organization, they can either believe that they have systems, tools, processes, people, and so forth, the resources to ensure that their organization has not been breached. Then there's the organizations that have done the best job they can by addressing the various threat vectors, but are going to assume that they've been breached. And I think the mindset the new mindset has to be, there's got to be malware or other things that have gotten into the system. Let's figure out how to detect those and get them out of there, as opposed to believing that your firewalls and other things are doing the right job. So that's kind of one thing, just changing your mindset. The other is some basic blocking and tackling. You mentioned, all of the various threats that these organizations are seeing. Given that, you have to really prioritize where you're spending your time, attention, and your resources. So they should, your listeners should be performing periodic risk assessments to understand where their protected health information is living, where it's stored, if you will, an inventory of where it is, and more specifically where the most high-risk issues may be. So if they do an inventory and they realize that they have hundreds and thousands of endpoint devices that may be unencrypted, and that may be that they're most likely threat vector, then they should address that. If it turns out that it's malware because they have multiple business associates managing their data that may or may not be as secure as they are, they should address that, right? So versus trying to be worried about everything, they need to center in on what they should be most worried about, and then do their best to address those issues first.
Yeah, those are pretty much all the questions that I have, unless there's anything else you wanted to touch on before we leave.
Yeah, we were talking about medical identity theft a minute ago, and one of the things that I find needs more discussion is the impact that medical identity theft and medical fraud, basically the resulting medical fraud, has on not only the institutions, right, so the organizations that have been breached, but also on the consumers, the patients, the members whose information was stolen. And so, Jeff, if I asked you, what do you think? What's the worst that can happen if someone takes your Social Security number and sets up a credit card? What's the worst that can happen to you?
Well, just talking to my family and friends, I think the perception out there is that with credit cards, there's not, that much concern just due to the fact that the banks reimburse you pretty much for those charges.
Yeah, now, when I tell you, what if your medical identity has been compromised by a criminal hacker? What would you be concerned about? In terms of the worst thing that could happen or some of the things that could happen, what would you think about when I say, if I told you, Jeff, your medical identity has just been compromised from a healthcare insurance company, what pops into mind in terms of the things you're most concerned about?
Well, I guess one of the worst case stories I've read recently was just people basically getting misdiagnosed because other people will go into hospitals kind of using your name, and then that gets put on your medical record, and then you end up getting the wrong medication or the wrong treatment. And I think there's been some cases where I think people have been seriously injured, if not killed. I don't know off the top of my head.
Well, you are probably 1 in 1,000 that answered the question correctly. So
I've read a lot about this recently.
Yeah, I imagine. But that's really the problem with the knowledge gap with most consumers is they think about, or they read about medical identity theft, and when they think about it, they think, well, it maybe like a financial identity theft where someone uses their credit, their Social Security number to set up a financial account, which, as you said, can be dealt with relatively easily and quickly and at minimal or no cost to the consumer. But in the case of medical identity theft, besides diagnosis, mistreatment, delay in treatment, those kinds of things, if you can imagine your electronic health record, which unfortunately gets propagated across multiple systems relatively quickly when you get into the system, like when you go to an emergency room, for example. You're not only checked in on the hospital systems and their medical record systems, but pharmacy systems are activated. There's a whole host of other systems within the hospital food chain that also receive your data when you receive medical testing and other things that go on. And the problem with there's two problems with the medical identity theft problem. One is the fact that you mentioned earlier that if you have the wrong blood type in your record, or they don't know that you have certain allergies like to penicillin or something, that because your friendly perpetrator doesn't, someone who's used your identity, it can literally kill you, right? So that's one of the negative outcomes. The one that's a little more hidden is the fact that it turns out that this data that's out there about us, our health in particular, affects other aspects of our life. So, for example, if your friendly a friendly criminal attacker has basically a heart condition, right? So he or she has to take some form of heart medication. Once that enters the medical systems, it's picked up by an organization called the Medical Identity Bureau, which is checked by the life insurance companies to determine whether or not you're insurable for life insurance. And we've had a case where actually one of our advisors as a business had lost his briefcase in which he had his medical identity, his health insurance number included. And literally they refused, the insurance company, life insurance company, refused to give him life insurance because his medical records showed he was taking some form of medication for a heart condition. And it took a while to clear that because he had to prove that he wasn't taking those medications and so forth. And so it just takes time. There's multiple implications of the data being propagated, misused, and so forth. That causes expense, time, and other things, just potential for bad outcomes to the patients.
Well, thanks for taking the time, Rick. We appreciate it.
I appreciate the opportunity to share the report with you and your listeners.
And that's it for this week's Cybercrime and Business podcast. As always, you can follow us on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you listen. And for more information, check out SurfWatchLabs.com.